very pleased to be here and to present to you some of the results that we have gathered over the last approximately 8 years with a group of researchers, approximately 35 from across the European countries, so really across the EU 28. As was already said, I'm Diana Reckien, Associate Professor in the Netherlands, and also coordinating chapter lead author for the next or the current IPCC assessment cycle, in which I am co-leading with 2 other coordinating lead authors, a chapter that summarizes the practice on adaptation across regions and across sectors, and where we are supposed to, where we have the mandate to show decision-making options solutions. This is actually very new for this IPCC assessment cycle, that now the focus should be on solutions and not so much on impacts anymore. And this feeds very well back into the work that I am doing, where I'm really trying to see what works in cities, what are cities planning, what are they implementing, what works, what doesn't work, which cities need help and why, and what could help them. So just a little bit of background. Just a few words about myself. I grew up in a very science-oriented family, actually. So I was brought up with natural science education, where books were highly valued, and I was out and about in nature and really grown up in a natural environment a lot. And this was in a decade, and when the Earth itself, when it was already known that the Earth is actually endangered, and that the environment and biodiversity and nature itself is actually endangered, and that we all need to do something to ameliorate the situation that was actually in the 1970s. So this is kind of more than 40 years back. And already then it was understood that each individual kind of needs to do something and needs to contribute something to make our world a better place. And that each person living in each community or city can do a little bit to let the nature and natural environment around us revive and get into a better state. So, as I said, that's kind of 45 years back. Now we are in 2019. Last year, the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius report of the IPCC came out. And in there, we have seen the latest science that what it needs to actually keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, whether it's feasible and under which conditions it's feasible. And there are, of course, different scenarios, so you can reach 1.5 degrees under different conditions. For instance, you can first overshoot, as it's called, so get higher than 1.5 degrees and later return to it. Or you can say, okay, we do not overshoot and just keep 1.5 degrees throughout. And when we want to do this, just keeping to 1.5 degrees, this means that we would need 0 CO2 emissions globally by 2050, and plus large reductions of methane emissions. This would translate into approximately 45% of CO2 emission reductions by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, and may still include CO2 removal. CO2 removal means that when already carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, there is actually technology to take it out of the atmosphere again, to bind it, and then to either store it in containers below the ground or in other containers. So this might still be needed, and even if we reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, we still have the need for large-scale adaptation, because still cities at deltas or regions in low-lying areas or low-lying island states like the Maldives, for instance, or other islands, they are still threatened and impacted by 1.5 degrees Celsius. But this is, in a nutshell, what we need to aim for. Yeah? And this really shows us, and the report showed us, that we need to get to work. Because we can still do it, yeah? But we need to have approximately 40 to 55% emission reductions by 2030. And this is rather soon. We also see that nation states are actually progressing. Yeah? Here, a picture from when the Paris Agreement was finally negotiated and concluded, so adopted at the Paris conference, yeah, which is a huge step and absolutely unprecedented to everything what we have seen before. So we can really say that nation states are willing to do something. But even with all the emission reduction goals that the nations have put forward under the UNFCCC, we would only reach approximately 3 degrees Celsius increase until 2100. So we wouldn't reach 2 degrees and not at all 1.5 degrees. This actually tells us that other actors need to come into play. And this is where cities and also citizens get important. Of course, best if all these actors interact and cooperate and act in a joint manner. No one can do it alone, and we see that one entity has problems to really do it on their own. Yeah? I today mainly talk about cities and what cities are doing, have been doing, what they haven't been doing. But I also, at the end, summarize a little bit what citizens can do and what I think citizens, all of us, need to, what we should think of, how we can contribute. Okay. So the whole cities research for me that I'm presenting today started with the quote, "Cities lead the way in climate change actions." That's a quote by Kowski and Schneider and was already published in a paper in the year 2003. So that's also quite some time ago, yeah? Time flies. And back then, actually, I asked myself, is that true for European cities? And since then, we are assessing how European cities are actually implementing and planning climate change actions. This is a map of a so-called representative sample of EU cities, so cities in all EU member states that cover at least 20% of the national population in their country, and cities that are regionally distributed with larger as well as smaller cities. So you can say, if you assess what's happening in these cities, you really have a good overview of what's happening in Europe, in European municipalities. And today I want to highlight and elaborate and later hopefully also discuss with you 3 questions. This is, how is climate change planning progressing on the ground? This is, are the targets sufficient to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees? And this is, which cities need help and by which aspects do they need help if they want to plan and address climate change. And then at the end, I also draw a couple of lessons learned. So let's start with the first question. How is climate planning progressing on the ground? We've made a couple of assessments. The first one from December 2013 only covered 200 of those cities that I just showed you. And here we can see that, so each city has one icon, just a dot is a city that has no plan. A rectangle is a city that has a mitigation plan. And a rectangle is a city that has a mitigation and an adaptation plan. So there you see, for instance, that cities in the UK have quite a lot of local climate plans. Also here in the Netherlands and in Germany. Still Italy, quite a few, but it gets a little bit diverse when you get further south. And also Spain, you have a few cities that have no plan, as well as in France. So there is a little bit a north-south divide, you would say. And then the color code behind the country shows how much the country would reduce its emissions when we sum up all the local emission targets. So let's say here in the UK, all these cities plan for 40% emission reductions, or actually they would all have more, Then we would sum that up and we would reach that as a country you would actually reduce by more than 50%. So there you also see that in the north and in France and Germany, the emission reduction goals are a bit higher than in the south. And actually cities and municipalities in Italy, for instance, they had the lowest ambitions. So they only said, oh, we can just reduce on average by 10% or so. That was in 2013. Overall, we saw that across these 200 cities, 65% of cities had an adaptation plan, 29% had 65 had a mitigation plan, 29% had an adaptation plan, and 35% of cities had no plan. So it's a little bit like 2/3 have a mitigation plan, 1/3 an adaptation plan, and 1/3 do not yet have a plan. Then we did a similar assessment in December 2016, so with the cutoff date of December 2016. And this time, for all 885 cities. The pictograms are a little bit different now because we have more distinction, we have different plans, but I walk you through. So again, the triangle is for cities that have only a mitigation plan, and you really see a lot of them in Eastern Europe, in Italy, and also in Spain. And here in Spain you also see that cities were really progressing in these 3 years only, although we also covered more cities, but still you can see progress in these 3 years. Then we have cities with only adaptation plans, and those we didn't see in 2013, and they are very rare. You have here one in Romania, you have here one in Germany, one in the Netherlands, and a couple in the UK, but really very few. So usually cities start with a mitigation plan, and that's also good, yeah, because greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide is actually the source of the problem. So it's best if we tackle that first. Then we have this icon with the kind of 5 corners or 5 edges, this light green one, and this means that we have a city with separate mitigation and adaptation plans. Those are a couple in Spain, also in Portugal, and in Germany, also in Denmark, in Sweden, northern countries. And then we have the dark green, and this is where mitigation and adaptation is actually covered in the same plan. This is important for reason that when you combine it in one plan, you can actually see synergies. So you can actually be aware that you are implementing something that is benefiting both. Yeah? And these are mostly seen in France and in the UK. And this is because, and that's the country color in this map, this is because the UK and France, they have a so-called, and Denmark and Slovakia, they have a so-called climate law. And this is that the national government demands local municipalities to develop a local climate plan. So cities in these countries have to develop local climate mitigation and often also adaptation plans. Yeah? And you really see that this helps and that then people start to think about climate change. Overall, we have a similar pattern actually, but now 3 years later and for more cities. Approximately 2/3 of the cities across whole Europe have mitigation plans. A little less than 1/3 have adaptation plans, and still 1/3 have no plan. So that is kind of the rule of thumb. So then, a second aspect, how is climate change planning progressing on the ground? And already now with the latest map, you have seen that there are different types. We mainly see 3 different ones, and this is first, that cities plan for climate change in so-called dedicated local climate plans. So these are plans that only focus on climate and say we want to reduce this and this much, and we want to adapt to strong rain and heat waves by this and this. Yeah? You have these in 3 different forms, independently developed or demanded by the nation state, or also just supported by climate networks. But these are focusing on the climate issue. And then you have sectoral plans, which we call vertically mainstreamed, and these really look at a sector. For instance, energy or transport, or you look at particular impacts like flood risk or heat waves. So they are also important, but they only cover a part of the whole problem. Yeah? And then we have plans that really address the topic in a very holistic way. So these are sustainability plans or resiliency plans, and they want to address climate change, but also cover a couple of other problems that cities have, like often air pollution, noise pollution sometimes, lack of greenery. Yeah? So they try to address a couple of these urban issues at the same time. when we plot them again across all cities of Europe, we see that for mitigation, we have all these different sorts that we had under dedicated plans are now green. So that mitigation plans, so those that address reduction of CO2 emissions, that they are mostly those plans that really target the climate issue. And we have very few energy plans or sustainability plans or master development plans. And for adaptation, this is much higher, the percentage. So a much larger fraction of adaptation plans try to tackle the issue in a holistic way. This has advantages and disadvantages. Approximately three times as many plans that target adaptation are so-called mainstreamed plans. So they are cross-sectoral, they are very broad, and they try to cover the climate issue together with other urban issues. When these mainstreamed plans are well thought through and concrete, they can actually be a good way of implementing the climate issue into other sectoral plans, like in transport planning or energy, as I have shown. But we need to be careful. Sometimes these mainstream plans or these broad cross-sectoral plans are so general that they also kind of lose the climate ambition. So this is something to watch out for. Yeah? Okay. So then we kind of covered the first question, and this is how is climate planning progressing on the ground. We see that municipalities do that via dedicated climate plans or these cross-sectoral and sectoral plans, so mainstreamed climate plans, in particular for adaptation. And we see that 2/3 of cities have local mitigation plans, 1/3 have an adaptation plan, and 1/3 of cities have no plan so far. So the second question was, when we look into these plans, are there targets for CO2 reduction? Are they sufficient to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees? And here we remember that keeping to 1.5 degree means 0 CO2 emissions by 2050 and minus 45, so 40 to 50 emissions by 2030. The same for 2 degrees is, this means 0 emissions globally by 2075 and minus 20% of CO2 emission reductions, CO2 emissions by 2030. We can plot that on such a graph as well. Yeah, here the colors again. So yellow showing the reduction target in 2030 and 2050, and red showing the reduction target in 2030 and 2075 respectively. When we assume that the reduction goes steadily, we would see this trajectory. And now we add what we have seen by looking into the local climate plans in Europe. And this is actually that we see a 37% reduction of the cities that we have analyzed in the EU 11, so those 200 cities. Yeah? And this would translate into 27% of emission reductions for the EU 28 as a whole. So this is approximately here. To reach 2 degrees, we would need 23% more, and to reach 1.5 degree, we would actually need 63% more. So this is quite substantial. Yeah. The data behind this is a little bit difficult to calculate because every city has a different time frame. Yeah, so they don't all aim for 2050, but in a very general sense. So it might be that we underestimate this a little bit. So it might be that we are a little bit higher because some cities already try to get emission reductions by 2040 or so. So we might underestimate that a little bit, but overall, I think we can say we are not yet on a good trajectory and we need stronger emission reductions for both 2 degrees Celsius as well as 1.5. So that's kind of the second question and the answer to the second question. And then we had the third question. Which cities need help and by which aspects? And there we started with plotting which cities have local climate plans per size. Yeah? On the left-hand side here, you see cities in clusters per size. And then it is important to look at the yellow colors, so cities that have no plan. And we really see that the smaller the city is, the more often you don't have a local climate plan. So we would conclude that smaller cities in particular need support. Yeah. But this is only kind of half of the answer, because we need to distinguish between those countries that have no climate law and those countries that have a climate law. So where local climate plans are mandatory. And in those 4 countries that you have previously seen in one of the maps, UK, France, Denmark, and Slovakia, you see that actually here no plans. There are still smaller cities that don't have a plan, but some very small cities have a plan. So this city size relation does not really hold. And from that, we would conclude that a climate law is actually a good start. Germany is currently talking about one. I don't really see it yet. I'm hoping, of course, but yeah, it really depends on economies and how they are involved in politics, is my impression. So 4 to 5 countries in Europe, depending on the definition, have a climate law that demands local municipalities up to a certain size to develop climate plans. Furthermore, we see that in cities, cities that have a rather solid GDP, so where GDP per capita is high, those have local climate plans. So there is a relation to economic strength as well, to finances. Yeah? Then we see many plans in cities that have good and numerous institutions. Yeah? So where, let's say, you have more planning authorities and other institutions, NGOs, and so in networks, in local networks and other institutions involved. And then you see a lot of local climate plans in cities that become member of international climate networks. I don't know whether you have heard about C40 or Climate Alliance, Cities Alliance, Global Covenant of Mayors, or ECLAY is another one. So these are networks that work for cities. You can become a member. And then these networks, they spread information and knowledge how to develop a local climate plan. They also direct you to funding sources, and they can actually find you partnerships, so city partnerships, which work towards mutual helping. We see few local climate plans, on the other hand, in cities with a high unemployment rate. So this is kind of the counter side of high GDP, yeah, where you have a high unemployment rate. Really, cities apparently have other problems than looking into climate change, preparedness, and planning. Yeah? And I have to say, well, this is fair enough. I totally understand that concern. Yeah? Cities that have a high unemployment rate, they have other problems. So best to not push for a climate change agenda and a climate change focus singularly, but try to combine that with other aspects that are much higher on the agenda. For instance, job creation. So there is also a large opportunity, but the cities need to see that opportunity, right? And then, very surprisingly actually, we have very few local climate plans in cities at the coast. Yeah, this is surprising, but that was definitely found in the 2013 data, so the smaller sample that we looked at. And one of our interpretations is that maybe cities at the sea have lived with climate and weather disruptions for such a long time in history that they think, the next flood or the next storm, we will manage it. We have storms and floods for the last 800 years and we have still survived. So maybe there is this notion of, we'll manage, we had that for many, many centuries. And also we see that actually cities in the south of Europe had fewer local climate plans. That is also what I meant with the north-south gradient in the first maps I had shown you. And this in turn is related to GDP, I could imagine. Yeah? So there is also a financial and also an institutional relation there. I just learned that there is no planning tradition in Spain, so planning as a tradition would be regarded as an institutional asset. Yeah? So if you have planning institutions in place, maybe they can take up that issue earlier or make people aware than in other countries. Okay. So we conclude cities at the coast in southern Europe, where actually high future impacts are expected, and with low institutional and financial capacity need support. Climate networks are important information sources, so they can help. And now I turn to the second kind of part of that question, and by which aspects do these cities need support? And there I look again at first mitigation and then adaptation plans. Looking at mitigation, you would probably start to think, okay, when I want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I best do that in sectors that emit most. And this is actually what we find. So we see that energy saving, energy efficiency, and renewable energies are those sectors or those aspects that are mostly mentioned in mitigation plans, and I would say, okay, that is a good start. Yeah. With adaptation, on the other hand, you would start to think a little bit different, and adaptation by the nature is to shield people, societies, municipalities, or sectors from impacts of climate change. So then you would start thinking, okay, who is actually affected, who is vulnerable? And there the question is, are current adaptation plans really looking at vulnerable sectors and people? In 2013, we found that mostly urban planning and development issues, water management and health aspects were mentioned in the adaptation plans. And in 2016, Excuse me that I didn't order it accordingly, yeah, but I hope you can see it still. There, environment, greenery, biodiversity, again the water sector, and also land use planning and zoning are those aspects or those sectors that are mostly used to adapt. This environment, greenery, biodiversity, you see it's the largest category that's actually new. And this is what is really on vogue in European cities at the moment. A lot of cities start adaptation through nature-based solutions. This is a perfect way to start. It's a good way. So a lot of cities actually are doing the right thing when they think about which species fit to the local environment, and if they don't invest too much in very water intensive species. Yeah. But as far as I can tell, a lot of cities that I have seen, they do this thinking and they plant species that are natural to the local environment. Also Barcelona is really taking that path, yeah, with the strategy of planting new street trees and a really extensive urban greening strategy. So this is a very progressive and promising way, because you can tackle a lot of problems at the same time. Like as I mentioned before with the sustainability plans, same as it here for urban greenery. You can reduce air pollution, you can reduce heat, you reduce runoff during flooding. Yeah, so you have multiple aspects that actually ameliorate with urban greening. Okay, but still the question is, so we would conclude that probably adaptation plans target vulnerable sectors, yeah? But I'm still questioning, are adaptation plans actually benefiting vulnerable people? And here we come back to the equity and justice issue, which is also very much at my heart and also a research focus of mine. So I then asked, adaptation plans, are they actually targeting vulnerable populations, vulnerable groups? And usually adaptation plans have 5 sectors. So first they look at impacts, then they talk about what the city plans to do, so talks about adaptation measures. Then we have a section on, sometimes, a section on participation, a section on communication, so to whom the results will be brought and broadcasted and communicated. And then we have a section on monitoring and evaluation. The height of the bar shows how many of the plans that we looked at had actually that section. Yeah? And you see adaptation measures have a lot of them, so that are actually all of them, but many local adaptation plans don't talk about communication, and not a lot actually currently look at monitoring and evaluation. And the orange part now looks at whether vulnerable groups are mentioned. And there we looked for elderly, for children, for sick people, hospitals, whether hospitals are mentioned, migrants, elderly kids, vulnerable poor people. Yeah, so all these usually believed to be vulnerable groups, whether they are mentioned and targeted. And there you see that actually during participation, so developing the plan and monitoring and evaluation, those groups are hardly targeted, which means that people who are vulnerable and who should benefit from adaptation are not involved in the plan making. And even after implementation of adaptation options, it is rarely checked whether the measure benefits vulnerable people. Yeah, so my general conclusion is that we really need to get better in this. Adaptation needs to target those that are vulnerable and those that have the highest impact. And we need to get better in, first of all, implementing this with people who are affected together, and in checking whether their situation has actually ameliorated. So that brings us to the conclusion of the third question. And here I would conclude that we need support for smaller cities, cities at the coast, cities in Southern Europe, and cities with low institutional or financial capacity. And we could best do this through climate networks, through national climate laws, or also through city partnerships, is my view. And what we also need to get better in is a focus on vulnerable groups and adaptation in all cities and all plans. So this is not just in certain cities. That's what we see at the moment. General lessons learned are, and this is a recap of the whole presentation now, yeah, that climate planning is actually substantially progressing on the ground and is best done via a dedicated and a mainstreamed plan that has other research shown. Targets are not yet sufficient to reach 1.5 to 2 degrees. We need to get a bit more ambitious. Yeah. Vulnerable locations and people need support, for instance, through climate laws and climate networks. And this is a disclaimer that with that research, we have looked at climate plans, but these climate plans really only are the first, though necessary, but first step in doing adaptation and mitigation. So they are only looking at the planning output and the planning process at best. But we need to get better in implementing measures and in monitoring and evaluating them. And after implementation, that we see, okay, this has worked, this has not worked, so that we are better in knowing what is really effective. And we need more focus on vulnerable groups and locations. And this also brings me then to what I think we all as citizens can do and have to do, because we've seen that both countries or nation states, but also cities, have problems in implementing climate change measures on the ground. And that's why I think what we really need help with is more engagement by the citizens, civil action, civil requests. I don't say civil unrest, but requests, and civil interference. And we need more bottom-up initiatives requesting change by politicians and planners. Yeah? I really think that we need all three at the moment because, there are too many vested interests and too many other issues like short planning cycles and so forth that make it also difficult for cities to plan ahead. And with that, I think we are on the way of making our globe and our Earth a better place to live and to improve the environment for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. I guess we can take a seat
and
open the floor for question. It has been extremely interesting. While they're setting the stage and closing these lights, I would have a provoking question before starting with a question from the audience, which is, Because I guess it's really interesting to understand how climate plans, through plannings, right, tackle the issues. And we saw the evolution and the state of the art. Then myself being a planner, I remember already in I guess 20 years ago already, there was one internationally renowned scholar, Michael Newman, which published a very good paper in a top journal arguing the title, Does Planning Need a Plan? So questioning that planning itself, so the management of the environment, city and region, no? So does planning processes really need a plan? Why? Because planning was, I mean, we planners all know that planning can be extremely inefficient and lots of plans can just stay there. And I mean, myself, I came from Italy, so you cannot imagine how easy it is to draw a very good plan and then implementation is aside, right? Is another issue. And so I was wondering how much, since you tackled the planning implementation at the end, among other things, right? So how important is it to have good plans? Mm-hmm. Since, and this is to come back maybe to other question, because we already saw that law and regulation can be better pushing for action. Action can be framed through plan, as we see, but then some thought about this planning through plan, or what else?
Yeah. Yes, I think it works. Yes, still works. Naturally, seeing these data, I share your concern, but I would argue that we first need a good plan, yeah, and then we need new professions. We need, next to planners, we need implementers, and then we need monitorers or something like that. So there is actually research asking planners what they think about plan implementation and plan monitoring. A recent study just last year that was done on Canadian planners. And not surprisingly, these planners said, you know, I'm a planner and I really like to make plans, but then whether it's implemented, I don't really care. And whether it's monitored, I care even less. And I have to say, to a certain aspect, or a certain respect, I understand it. Because planners learned to make a plan, and I think this is still important, to lay out the process, to imagine where do I want to go, what do I want to have achieved in 2020. This means breaking down in 2018, I need to have this, in 2016 I need to have this, or first we do this until 2020, afterwards because of budget constraints we do this. So envisioning the whole process and having targets is very important, but I kind of share the notion that we need more professions who tackle the whole issue, and I understand that not only planners can do it, yeah? So, like I said, maybe we need implementers and monitorers or so, yeah.
So let's open the floor to the potential implementers here. Any question, remarks? I know we have experts in the field here, hiding themselves.
¿Me puedes traducir? ¿Sí? Vale. ¿Cómo integrar la planificación urbanística con todos los vectores que integran el análisis del cambio climático, atendiendo a que la planificación urbanística es estática y lo que estamos hablando se nutre de cuestiones dinámicas? Y al final es muy importante la ordenación de los usos, ¿no? El régimen urbanístico del suelo también va condicionado al impacto ambiental en las ciudades, ¿no? No sé qué experiencias, cómo se analiza, cómo se aborda, ¿no? en otros países estas dos cuestiones.
Te traduzco a ver si me la pregunta.
So the question is how to integrate dynamic issues in a city or the dynamic issue of climate change. No, the static. What is static? Both are dynamic. Huh? Say again, please. Yeah.
Los planes urbanísticos en España, básicamente, pues, se elaboran, o sea, la planificación urbanística requiere de la elaboración del plan. Entonces, con la memoria, con una serie de documentación, y requiere de la tramitación de la evaluación ambiental estratégica, que es el procedimiento de evaluación ambiental de planes y programas de la Unión Europea. Esto por un lado. Y la Ley de Cambio Climático obliga a introducir toda la cuestión de cambio climático en los planes urbanísticos. Pero ¿qué pasa? Que, como bien ha dicho, una cosa es la elaboración y luego su aplicación. El plan urbanístico, la tramitación y aprobación, más o menos dura entre 5 años aprox, desde que se empieza hasta que se finaliza, siempre que no lo impugnen. Entonces, claro, todo el análisis de cambio climático en este tiempo se ha desdibujado. La cuestión es, entonces, ¿cómo abordamos todo lo que se refiere a los vectores de cambio climático en la planificación urbanística, que es estática? ¿Sí?
Yes, thank you. So cities that are currently kind of showcases and that really have ingrained the climate issue a lot and are really addressing and motivated to address the issue seriously. They are bringing out new plans every 2 years. That is what I have seen. There are a couple of cities in Germany where planning also has a strong tradition, and they have the plan from, one is I have in mind is 2012, I think the other 2014, and then they check every 2 years whether they actually are on track with both mitigation and also with adaptation, and they then bring out adjusted goals and change their goals every 2 years and say, like, okay, in this it was successful, here we are fine, but in that sector our mitigation targets didn't work, so we need to do more there. So I don't see that necessarily planning has to be that static. I agree that it is a bit more static than everything around us, you know, but it can be made a bit more dynamic than just having one plan every 10 years or so. Also with the targets that I showed, a lot of cities have long-term targets, like what they want to have achieved in 2050, but able to seriously reach that and seriously try reaching that, you need much smaller targets. So you need a target for almost every 2 years, or most cities have it for 2020, then for 2030, for 2040, and for 2050. Yeah? And they regularly check, often on such a trajectory, whether they are at least half or almost on the trajectory or not. Yeah.
Sí.
Thank you for your nice presentation. I would like to know, what do you think, in your opinion, what do you think that the best way to introduce the climate change challenges in cities is to approve a climate adaptation plan, or maybe approve other political, other requirement, regulatory laws, ordinance, or something like that, or different project is more effective approve a specific adaptation plan in the city? Thank you.
If you ask me about effectiveness, I think I have a devastating answer. It's just top-down regulation is more effective, yeah, than waiting for bottom-up and very democratic processes. The problem is that these, in our democratic and hopefully they stay democratic, so I'm a defender of democracy in that respect, but in our democratic systems, top-down decisions are also not easy to implement because they're just not accepted. And we luckily have interest groups, NGOs, and so forth that have the right to voice their concerns and to lobby against it. But if the policies would be daring, would be brave, then a top-down approach is still more effective. Yeah, I think the question is to find a top-down approach that works for most people in a society and that opens up opportunities so that also industries mostly and occupations, so people in rather traditional industries, working in traditional industries, that they also see that the top-down policy is caring for them and is opening up opportunities for them. Yeah, so such a top-down policy would need to be extremely social. Extremely social. You can't go after economic interests when you want to do that from top down. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Actually, we're mixing a lot of things when we try to give answer to that, because one thing is emission target reduction, mitigation, then maybe it's easy to just cut down the emission, no? Top-down regulation. Then climate change adaptation could be really like addressing a variety of factors and different perspectives, and so and you cannot just adapt climate change by top-down regulation, otherwise just end up with big infrastructure, top-down and big investments, and then you're falling in traps that we've been explored during previous sessions.
Although there are examples, good that you mentioned it, and generally I agree, mitigation, adaptation are really kind of two different things, and you have to either think in that domain or that domain. But when you say that adaptation is very local, there are contrary examples, and they are very interesting, and that, for instance, is the Netherlands. Okay, the Netherlands isn't big, so it's a rather small country. Yeah, maybe that also counts. But 65% or so of the country's area is below sea level. And adaptation in the Netherlands is not planned from the bottom up. The local communities do not really care or invest time and effort in adaptation. This is managed by the state. There is this so-called Delta program, and this is a national program in which plans are made and funding is provided for extremely large-scale adaptation projects. So the Delta program implements measures in certain areas, though. So yeah, but it's planned from the nation state, where measures in those locations that have water issues. Either too much water, too little water, or water quality issues. These are the three aspects. And the nation state, the national government decides, okay, in these locations, we have problems with too much, too little, or water quality. And in the next 10 years, we invest really a lot of money. They invest a lot of money to build a new dam there or to invest in water purification there or there. So there are also national approaches, although they are locally implemented, yeah, but they are managed by the state. So there are actually quite a few options, and different countries really tackle it differently. Yeah, but the Netherlands is a small country, so maybe that is also
with
counts.
a good planning tradition.
Yeah, exactly.
If you are a good planning
Yeah.
tradition.
But that is very effective, actually. This water management program at the national level. Yeah.
Okay. Whom else? Yes, Massimiliano.
I was wondering why the UK seems to have done so much better than many other countries. Is there one factor there? And also, to what extent do you think the population of the UK is aware of that success?
Oh, the second question, I have to say I don't really know. I can just assume, at least from talking to my researcher colleagues, there is more awareness in terms of weather, yeah, weather conditions. And that is maybe makes you more likely to also think about changing weather, and then you are not far away from changing climate. The UK is more advanced than any other country in Europe by far. Maybe France would be second at the moment because both have a climate law. But the UK adopted its climate law in 2010 already. And this is now 9 years back. So every city in the UK above a certain size has to have a local climate plan for mitigation and for adaptation. And because of, I believe, that sensitivity of being an island, being surrounded by the sea, and that's why being impacted by extreme weather conditions for many, many years and centuries in the past, that's why there was this awareness, and that's why they are so advanced and already implemented the climate law as the first country in Europe, and that really is visible. So you have a long tradition in planning and also in environmental planning, and then you have the climate law. Yeah?
Hello, Massimiliano, PhD student from Politecnico di Torino, Italy. So let's move from good practice UK to bad practice Italy. According to what you said, Italy, that has not a national climate adaptation plan, there's no top-down movement. It seems that we are totally fucked up. Well, I don't know. I think there are chances to act locally without a rigid top-down legislation.
Yeah, they are.
First. Second, climate change adaptation means a lot of things. We can have, we can define it very generally, very vague. And there's a big gap in research in terms of trying to understand how each city define climate change adaptation. Everybody copy and paste from IPCC, a general vague definition, and no one is making this effort of envisioning and defining locally. Adaptation is a very context-sensitive issue. It means floods, it means tornadoes, it means heat waves, it means a lot of things. So don't you think maybe it's better to separate each extreme event and tackle sectorially instead of creating this big umbrella and in order to avoid this sense of overwhelmedness, tackling this big issue? Thank you.
Okay. Two important issues. Thank you for the question. The first one, about Italy, brings me to pointing out the usefulness of climate networks. Because we have seen that particularly in those countries where you have no national climate change adaptation or mitigation plan, which can act as a guiding instrument for local municipalities. So in particular in those countries like Italy, where you do not have plans at the national level, in these countries, cities form coalitions of the willing, so to say. Yeah? In Italy, you have a lot of regional climate networks. Our collaborators in Italy, I forgot, but they found, I don't know, 8 or so regional climate networks. So where actually just in one region, all the smaller cities come together and think what they can do. And this can be very effective, let's say, on the watershed level or so, yeah? So you have a lot of regional city networks in Italy, and many cities in Italy become member of these international climate networks, C40, ICLE, Covenant of Mayors. And Italy is the country with most members in the Covenant of Mayors, actually. So you have this bottom-up movement, and apparently cities find ways how to get information when they want to do something and when they want to ameliorate the situation for their citizens. Second question about adaptation. I totally agree, and I see that as a big gap in science and research, that adaptation is still so vague. When you are a PhD student, you could make a really substantial contribution in trying to establish a useful definition for what counts as adaptation. There's just 2 weeks back was another report in Nature Climate Change, and Lea Berang-Ford on adaptation monitoring across countries and governments, and they also confess that adaptation is still so everything and that there is no uniform definition. So we definitely need to get to that. Yeah, I agree. And in terms of separating, well, a couple of cities go that way, in that they have a flood plan, a heat plan, and then a stormwater plan, and I kind of doubt that that is a very effective way. My stand on that is that the uniform characteristic I see is that adaptation for all those climate impacts should first target the poor and the vulnerable. And actually, those that are vulnerable caused by flooding, vulnerable caused by due to heat waves, vulnerable due to storms, they are often, not always, and not in all countries, I agree, but often the same people. So when you start with a very pro-poor adaptation strategy, my impression is that you really tackle a lot of problems at the same time. And this is then the uniform aspect in adaptation. Yeah?
Francesc?
I'm going to speak Catalan.
Yes.
És una qüestió que va molt relacionada potser amb el que ja s'ha preguntat abans, que és amb la qüestió dels timings, dels temps, de com adaptar. La tecnologia els avenços tecnològics tenen molt a veure amb les capacitats de planificar accions contra el canvi climàtic. Aleshores, aquests avenços tecnològics es produeixen a molta velocitat i molt sovint els que han de fer el pla o els que han de prendre decisions per aquests plans desconeixen quins són els avenços tecnològics suficients o que s'han donat per poder adaptar el pla en aquestes tecnologies. I al revés, grups d'investigació, grups tecnològics o empreses d'aquestes característiques els aniria molt bé saber quins reptes té l'aplicador del pla per poder incentivar recerca i avenços en aquestes direccions. De quina manera es pot treballar això? Quines pràctiques bones hi poden haver de relació entre l'avenç tecnològic i la realització del pla? O sigui, com es fan els avenços tecnològics i les realitzacions dels plans o els dissenys dels plans que es fan contra el canvi?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I very much like that question because it brings me to a topic that I was discussing with colleagues recently, and this is related to this new form of shared transport that we see in cities. Yeah, either shared bikes or now these shared roller scooters. Yeah, and I'm getting furious. Because research shows that this does not help in getting people out of the car onto the bike or onto these scooters. People who previously or also shared cars, yeah, it's a good idea, but research shows that people who do car sharing had no car before and now participate in individual transport, whereas these bikes and these scooters do not bring a substantial, I don't want to name numbers and percentages, but they don't bring people out of the car onto the bike and onto the scooters. So we have an enormous amount of resources that are used and wasted, I would say. Yeah? And what I think is lacking when we are allowing these new technologies to come onto the market and to be in our urban environment is that I think we always need two things. We need new technology that allows something, but at the very same time, we need to restrict something that we don't want. You cannot do it with one thing only. So like just having shared bikes or shared cars, yeah, as an opportunity doesn't bring people away from using cars. Just making public transport more comfortable doesn't bring people out of the car into a bus or public transport. You have to also restrict other modes of transport that are not good for your city, for your air, for your environment, or for the climate. So you need a restriction and then an opportunity what people that are suffering from that restriction, what they can use instead. And cities do not use that dual approach. And my impression is that that would at least be a little bit better than only the one or the other. And only restrictions are also very hard to implement. But this dual approach, I don't see it. I mean, in France is with these scooters, and in Germany as well. This is. I was surprised how easy these scooters came onto the market because there was no regulation. So they were actually, in Germany at least, they were built by the car industry because the car industry said Well, we offer this as an alternative, more renewable or more environmentally friendly options than cars. So, but you have the resource use, you have the batteries. I mean, also these scooters with all the batteries and the electric bikes, yeah, they have much more resource use than when you would use a normal scooter without a battery or a bike without a battery. So they were introduced by the car industry, and actually it turns out that it doesn't change the travel behavior of anyone apart from the pedestrians, you know. So it is mad, and we need to be more careful, particularly when we are aware of this thing that it didn't work, yeah. We immediately need to change something, but in that very particular example, I could see it from before because it was not combined with a restriction. Yeah.
That's it seems super interesting because it relates actually to what has been asked about the definition of adaptation. No?
Yeah.
That there are lots of different approaches to adaptation, how you adapt, how you change, and you could be reinforcing through better efficiency or reframing the tool use the very same pattern of development, which is not sustainable or which don't fix the issue. We just change some rule or change some dynamic, but not the structure. I would take some very last final remark if anybody wish to ask, and then just wait the microphone.
Hello, Diana. I would like to ask you, on the basis of your experience, from where can we expect cities being innovating in adaptation to climate change? What are the fields, the approaches? I don't know. What is your vision about this? Because we see that cities are those levels of government that innovate with regard to local challenges because they have the problem on the terrain. So also on this regard, what is your impression on in which areas do you think that we can expect or we can find at the moment innovation?
So in which cities we can see adaptation innovation at the moment, yeah? Mostly.
No,
in general. Yeah.
Adaptation to climate change.
Yeah.
Are we seeing cities looking for new ways in order to somehow overcome traditional problems, inertia, limitations that we know that exist from the beginning and that we need new solutions?
With me working in the Netherlands, actually, I always have the Dutch approach in my mind, and I think they're quite efficient and good in managing, so to say, the water. But they have also, and either too much water or too little water is kind of also a uniform impact of climate change that will affect most cities now or in the future even more. And the Dutch have actually changed their approach from maybe 20, 30 years back. Right after the Second World War until maybe 20 years ago, it was always keep the water out. Yeah? And they have built dikes and they have drained the land behind the dikes. So they have really tried to keep the water out, and now they changed that attitude. And although this strategy was still relatively successful,